Tonight on KQED Newsroom, the Supreme Court hands a major victory to hundreds of thousands of DACA recipients. But will it be short-lived? Also, we talk with University of California President Janet Napolitano about the DACA ruling, the pandemic, and educating the next generation. Plus, lawmakers on Capitol Hill debate police reform, with one California senator and possible presidential running mate leading the way. Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. Seminal decisions at the Supreme Court this week revealing the face of a changing nation. In a surprise ruling, the LGBTQ+ community was granted the right to work without discrimination throughout the country. And there was a win for many children of undocumented immigrants, those enrolled in the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. On Thursday, the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration cannot immediately end DACA. The Obama-era program has allowed roughly 700,000 young immigrants who were brought to the U.S. by their parents to live and work without fear of deportation. The recipients must pass background checks and reapply every 2 years to continue participating in the program. Conservative Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the court's liberal members in the 5-4 decision. Joining me now by Skype from Menlo Park is Santa Clara University School of Law professor Deep Gulasekaram. Professor Gulasekaram, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
California is home to the largest number of Dreamers, about 200,000 according to the Migration Policy Institute. Now, even though this is a federal program, are there differences in how states treat DACA recipients and the opportunities that are available to them?
There's certainly a huge variation across the United States about the types of protections states give to undocumented people generally, and then specifically policies related to youth and children. California is one of the most protective states in the United States. It allows undocumented children to access public universities, get funding for that, to access driver's licenses, to get professionally licensed in fields like law and medicine. And that is not the case in every state.
The Supreme Court ruling may only be a temporary reprieve. Could you tell us why that is and what we should be looking for in the days ahead?
Chief Justice Roberts' opinion is a very narrow opinion. What it's telling us is not that the Trump administration can't take away DACA, but that if they want to take away DACA, they have to do it in the right way and give the right reasons and actually consider carefully the actions that they're taking. If DHS wanted to, today, tomorrow, they could do such a thing. They could promulgate a memo that says, here are all the reasons we've considered, and now we are providing a better basis for taking away the program.
Do you think that's going to happen?
This has clearly been something that has been on the mind of President Trump and his DHS, his Department of Homeland Security, for some time. That said, it's an election year. We're 6 months out from that or 5 months out from that. And so all of those factors might play into whether DHS really has the stomach to go back and change and give another reason for taking away DACA.
While this decision was 5-4, split as close down the middle as possible, there's more consensus around another topic, specifically discrimination. Could you talk us through that piece of the ruling?
Sure. Both in the Ninth Circuit, the University of California case, and in a New York case called Batalla-Vidal, those were consolidated for the Supreme Court. The courts in both of those cases thought that there was enough evidence that DACA's rescission, taking it away, was based on animus against Latinos and Mexicans in particular. If you look at the program, 80% of DACA recipients are Mexican, 90% are Mexican and or Central American. And so the claim was that the rescission isn't really based on reason, but it's really based on racial animus, hatred or prejudice against that group. Supreme Court 8-1 said that there was insufficient evidence of discrimination for this to go forward. The only dissenter on that point was Justice Sotomayor. And I think that could have broader implications for racial discrimination claims in immigration more generally outside of this context.
In what way?
I think that if you look at Trump versus Hawaii, the case about the immigration ban or the travel ban or the Muslim ban, again, in that case, the Supreme Court majority on a 5-4 majority found that all the evidence of anti-Muslim statements by President Trump himself were insufficient to make out a case of religious discrimination as against the proclamation that banned the entry of people from majority Muslim countries. Here again, you have that same sort of rationale. So it seems like part of a broader project, at least on the part of Chief Justice Roberts and his wing of the court, not to allow those sorts of discrimination claims in the immigration context.
You know, there are a large number of undocumented immigrant children and young people who are not covered under DACA. For example, anyone who wasn't in the United States when the program began in 2012. Can you tell us about that population, both here in California and nationally?
Sure. I mean, ultimately, DACA and deferred action is never a complete fix. These programs all have requirements, and quite strict requirements, that leave out large swaths of the population. So I think if we're thinking forward, the only real fix, and many people have said this, is legislative. That is, we need to rethink whether there are pathways to regularize status, not just for DACA recipients, but for a much broader group who are undocumented. After DACA was created in 2012, that's when you got the significant child migration surges in 2014, again in 2016, and continuing with people fleeing violence in Central American countries. So the number of people who are not covered by deferred action programs is only going to grow.
And the DACA program also doesn't offer a path to citizenship. So are these recipients in legal limbo if they can't become citizens or permanent residents?
They certainly are. What they have now is the guarantee, at least for a temporary time, that they will not be removed, and during that time they can work or get work authorization and go to school. But that's all it provides. Until Congress steps in, and Congress is the only body that can do this through legislation, they would have to pass laws that provide some path to regularized status, as Congress did in 1986 when it allowed for a mass legalization of close to 2 million, 3 million people.
Could you zoom out for us and tell us what the next pressing battles in immigration are going to be?
Well, one, legislatively and politically, obviously, there's the battle over a more generalized, comprehensive reform that would increase channels of legal migration and also legal pathways for those here unlawfully. If we're looking just at court battles, I think there's a number. One of them has to do with detention and the use of the detention system and prolonged detention. There are, on a given night, there are 50,000, 60,000 immigrants locked in cages not for criminal activities. Second, the Trump administration is, through agency action, much like in the DACA case, but through other types of agency action, attempting to gut what is our asylum system, essentially take it away. And I think that will be another front of significant litigation in the coming months. And
this ruling and the court's earlier ruling in the week about LGBTQ+ rights to non-discrimination in the workplace were more liberal than expected from a conservative majority court. Should we look at that as a sign going forward for unexpected decisions?
Yeah, I think it's probably a little too thin of an evidence to suggest that the court is somehow turning in its ideological bent. The Bostock, which is the question of employment discrimination for LGBTQ folks, it was in many ways a fairly simple legal decision, and I think that is evidenced by the fact that it wasn't 5-4, it was actually 6-3. It's a very easy legal result to come to. The DACA decision, 5-4, but the fact is, I think Chief Justice Roberts would have written this decision whether it was a conservative agency action or a liberal agency action, because the grounds are quite narrow. All he's saying is that there's a very low bar for agency action.
Professor Deep Gulasekaram, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Janet Napolitano began her presidency at the University of California 7 years ago. Now, with campuses emptied by the coronavirus, Napolitano is overseeing distance learning for 285,000 students across the UC system. In August, she's stepping down from her post to join the faculty at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. Joining me now by Skype from Oakland is University of California President Janet Napolitano. She has also served as the Governor of Arizona and the Secretary of Homeland Security. President Napolitano, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm especially glad to have you on today because you have such a close connection to DACA. You authored the program under President Obama when you headed the Department of Homeland Security. What's your response to the Supreme Court ruling, and particularly now that President Trump has indicated he will fight it?
Well, obviously very pleased by the Supreme Court ruling. It allows all of our DACA students and the thousands of DACA students around the country to breathe a sigh of relief that they will not immediately see the program terminated and themselves being subject to deportation and loss of their work authorization. And frankly, as to the president, I just don't understand why he is so intent on going after these young people. They were brought here typically under the age of 6. They've been raised in this country. They really only know the United States as home. They're valuable, contributing members of our community, of our country. I just don't know why he has such a problem with them.
You know, when the Trump administration first announced in 2017 that it would rescind the DACA program, you and the UC Board of Regents were filed one of the very first lawsuits. Why is this issue so important to the UC system?
Well, because the University of California has about 1,700 DACA students in its student body to begin with. And secondly, challenging the rescission of the program, very consistent with the University of California's values of inclusion and values of equity. And, you know, the DACA program really helps so many young people brought to this country, as I've said, typically under the age of 6, who only know the United States as home, allows them to be in the country safely and also to get work authorization. So we have students that we wanted to speak out for, and it was very consistent with our values.
I want to turn now to race and gender. For 25 years, it's been illegal to consider race and gender in college applications in California. But this week, the UC Board of Regents have signaled that they want that practice to change. What is wrong with being blind to gender or race in the application process?
Well, because we don't live in a race-blind society, and I think the events of the past weeks have served to illustrate that. And, you know, in UC admissions, we look at 14 factors. The only factor we can't consider is race, ethnicity, or gender, which are very important as to the identity of a student. So it's an artificial limitation on their application.
And what are some of the other qualities that you are looking at?
We look at things like work experience. We look at things like did they take all the AP classes they could have taken? We look obviously at their grades. We look at their extracurricular activities. You know, all kinds of things. We just can't consider race, ethnicity, or gender. And as I've said, it's just such an artificial limitation.
And President Napolitano, for weeks now, protests against police brutality and systemic inequality have gripped our nation, and they've shown very clearly that there is racism in our institutions, including education. Could you talk about how that has impacted the UC system and changes that may be coming? Well,
let me begin by saying, I think like everyone, I was horrified at watching George Floyd's murder and then hearing about the other murders. They just illustrated a problem that we've had in our country going back centuries. And it's time to bring it out in the open, to confront it, to deal with it. And that goes with universities as well. So our campuses are engaging in conversations across the campus constituencies with respect to how members from underrepresented groups believe they are treated, what we can do and do better. And at the system level, we're focused on university policing. I had a task force a year ago that looked at how we do university policing, came up with a number of recommendations which we've implemented, but we're going to go back and look again to see what more we can do so that our relationship with our police is one of partnership, and we're fostering a culture of safety on our campuses, but not overbearing police presence.
You're also dealing with the effects of the pandemic. I understand that UC Davis has said that they will reopen their campus in the fall. Why that particular school, and what's happening with the other UC campuses?
Well, all of our campuses are going to be reopening to some degree. We're going to be hybrid, meaning that much of the academic program will still be delivered online, just as it's been this spring. And we're spending the summer really upping our game in terms of the quality of that online delivery. But we also recognize the value of the in-person experience. And so to the degree they can safely do it, and we have safety thresholds the campuses have to meet, the campuses are seeking to reopen and have some classes in person, and also to some degree reopening the dormitories.
You know, there's this ongoing cultural discussion about what viewpoints are appropriate to represent in the public sphere. In 2017, you shut down an appearance by a right-wing commentator following violent protests on campus. And more recently, there's been a backlash against an incendiary conservative editorial by Senator Tom Cotton arguing in favor of military intervention to the response against police brutality. Are there some voices that should not be heard in the current marketplace of ideas?
You know, the University of California is the home to the free speech movement. When we shut down the Milo Yiannopoulos event at Berkeley, that was to protect Milo because the protests had gotten out of hand. But we subsequently had Milo back on campus for what was called Free Speech Week. It cost us a lot of money to provide the extra security that was necessary. But different viewpoints, particularly on university campuses, should be heard. They should be debated. They should be refuted, but they should not be censored.
The world is shifting very quickly. What advice would you have for your successor, and what would you encourage the next generation to focus on learning?
My advice to my successor would be to spend some time getting to know the university, travel around the campuses, meet with students and faculty and staff, learn what the campus aspirations are, and set one or two big goals for the university that you can mobilize the whole system around. One of my big goals, for example, was that we would be carbon neutral by the year 2025, to lead by way of example in the fight against climate change. And with respect to educating the next generation, I think we cannot lose sight of what I believe to be the greatest existential threat confronting us, and that is the warming of the planet. So I do hope my successor will continue the pursuit of that goal and have some of his or her own as well.
President Janet Napolitano, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Facing a Monday deadline, lawmakers in Sacramento passed a temporary budget. Talks are continuing with Governor Gavin Newsom on how to close the $54 billion deficit created by the coronavirus pandemic. Steep cuts to education and healthcare services loom unless Congress approves a new round of funding for cash-strapped state governments. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, the Senate Judiciary Committee held its first hearing on police reform. Senate Democrats, led by California Senator Kamala Harris and New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, support bans on chokeholds and no-knock warrants. On Wednesday, GOP Senator Tim Scott unveiled his own police reform bill that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other prominent Democrats denounced for not going far enough. Joining me now by Skype to discuss all this from San Francisco is KQED politics and government correspondent Marisa Lagos, and NPR senior editor and correspondent Ron Elving joins us by Skype from Washington, D.C. Thank you both.
Thanks, Priya.
Good to be with you.
Marisa, let's start with the money. State lawmakers have passed a budget, but we're in this unusual position in which that budget isn't actually finalized. Could you talk us through why we're in this position and when we'll have a real budget?
Well, we're in this position broadly because of the coronavirus pandemic and the sort of economic cliff that California fell off, a $54 billion budget deficit that suddenly appeared after a surplus had been projected just months before. Lawmakers have to pass a budget by June 15th. They did pass something. It is not exactly what the governor wants. He is pushing for deeper cuts to help deal with that deficit that would take place basically July 1st when the fiscal year begins. They would like to see those cuts be sort of delayed a few months in the hopes that Congress will come through with more money, and also to see them not be quite as deep, to kind of move around some money in what critics call budget gimmicks.
Ron, let's toss that over to you because you're in D.C. What are the chances that there is going to be another round of stimulus funding? The House Democrats passed a $3 trillion stimulus bill about a month ago. It hasn't moved forward into the Senate. And we are hearing from Fed Chair Jerome Powell that he would like to see Americans get more cash relief.
Absolutely. And we have also heard from one of the economic advisors in the White House, Peter Navarro, that he would like to see the next package be at least $2 trillion. Now, that's not the $3.5 trillion that the House has already passed, but it's a much higher figure than the House Republicans wanted or what the Senate Republicans, where they're in charge, would sit still for. So we're a long ways apart. And usually the easiest thing to get people in Washington to do is get together on spending more money. But in this case, we've already spent so much money. Many of the Republicans are asking, when do we see results from this? Isn't the economy already getting better? Do we really need to do this right this minute? Isn't this really just to help the state governments out of their fiscal problems? And they point to a California or an Illinois and they say those people got themselves into their own problems. Now, that's not the view in the House, but that is the view among some Senate Republicans, and that's where we stand.
Ron, another major issue for the country and that's being talked about on Capitol Hill is police reform. There are different narratives that are winding their way through. What is taking hold, and is there any proposal for reform that looks like it could move through on a bipartisan basis?
No proposal thus far. I think the only thing they're agreed upon between the chambers, between the parties, is that they would like to do something. They would like to have a bill. They would like this not to just die. But what's been passed, or not passed yet, but proposed in the House and will be debated and voted on next week, would be pretty tough. It would put a federal ban on chokeholds, would change the law with respect to no-knock warrants for drug cases. It would also go after qualified immunity. That's a legal term that means essentially the police officers are very difficult to hold responsible in court for their actions. So all of those things are in the House bill. The Senate wants to sort of look at those things and disincentivize chokeholds as opposed to banning them outright as a federal law. So there's a gap between the two. And if there's any chance of bridging it, it would probably largely depend on people like Tim Scott, who's the only black Republican in the Senate, being able to sell his colleagues in that chamber on more of the House bill language.
Marisa, California often leads the way with various cultural ideas and discussions. This is certainly an area in which they could do that. What are the policy proposals that are being put forward that could take hold here in California when it comes to police reform?
Well, I think you kind of have to look at two things. What is happening statewide legislatively? I mean, to your point, we have actually led the way on a lot of the things we're talking about. We have a bill going into a law going into effect next January that's going to require more training. We've had the governor and the attorney general here in California both come out in favor of banning chokeholds. So I do think lawmakers in Sacramento will likely take up some of those issues and try to push maybe some of that training, perhaps even some qualified immunity questions and other sort of legal implications forward. But the truth of this is that a lot of these issues are really sort of come to bear at the local level. These are, involved in police union contract negotiations and what mayors and boards of supervisors and city councils approve when it comes to those union contracts. We have seen police unions in San Francisco and LA and San Jose, the three biggest cities, come out and say they would support some of the national reforms. But they're still backing ballot measures that are going to roll back some of the criminal justice reforms of recent years. So I think where the rubber meets the road here is going to be at the city level. And we have seen Mayor Garcetti in LA, Mayor Breed in San Francisco say they want to move police budget money into maybe, social services or mental health response teams, crisis response teams that can go and help out instead of sending an armed officer. But those reforms could take a while. And I do think that it's really going to depend on the pressure that the public keeps up on their local officials.
Let's turn to presidential campaign politics. Our Senator Kamala Harris seems to be on the short list for a vice presidential pick for Joe Biden. How does she stand in the horse race right now, and who else is in the running? And Marisa, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to tell right now. There is a list of some, I don't know, 8 to a dozen people that the Biden campaign has been apparently vetting. He has promised that the VP candidate will be a woman. Kamala Harris's name is up there, along with other prominent African Americans like Stacey Abrams, Florida Representative Val Demings, a former police chief herself. We've seen some not as well-known names, the governor of New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham. I think in some ways Kamala Harris brings a lot to the table. She is an African-American woman. She has this background in policing, but that's showed to be a double-edged sword, right, when she was running. And I think that there's this question now, as she tries to lead the way on Capitol Hill, if that's going to be enough for some people in the more progressive wing of the party. But I mean, I definitely think she's on the short list.
And Ron, I'd like to turn to you and talk about the Tulsa rally, actually, that is happening tomorrow. President Trump is planning to have this big rally despite fears of a coronavirus outbreak. And I'm curious about why you think it is so important for him to have an in-person rally when he is a master of getting his message out through social media and through the airwaves.
First of all, he loves these rallies. They are fun for him. They energize him. They make him feel the way he wants to feel as a national leader and as a candidate for re-election. Secondly, he sees them as some kind of a counter narrative to what we're otherwise hearing about his prospects, which is a series of polls that are going against the president. He's fallen from his highs in March to some of the lowest numbers of his presidency. Some of his approval polls are below 40. That's a real danger zone for an incumbent president to be below 40% approval. And he's trailing Joe Biden in some of these polls by double figures. So he's unhappy about that. He's arguing with it on social media. But what he really wants is a visual, vivid counter narrative of wonderfully excited Donald Trump fans in Tulsa or wherever else he goes next. Terribly excited to be with him and see him and restoring, if you will, the old energy of 2016.
Marisa, what do you think are the political vulnerabilities for President Trump and for Joe Biden as they're heading into the summer? Is there something that you think could derail either of their presidential campaigns?
I mean, I think certainly the economy for Trump is still a big issue. He's, hoping it turns around. I think how the coronavirus pandemic plays out, where you're seeing huge upticks in states like Florida and Texas, as well as California in those rates. I think those are the two sort of top things. I think that this policing conversation and race conversation is certainly something that Democrats are stronger to bring to voters and talk about. But that can be a tough thing for someone like Joe Biden, who's in his 70s and has not always been so progressive on those issues.
Yeah. Yep. Marisa Lagos with KQED, Ron Elving with NPR. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
You can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/KQED-newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me through my social media handle, Priya D. Clemens. For all of us here at Newsroom, thanks for watching. Good night.